Happy Wednesday! You're listening to Mama Murdah Podcast. I'm your host, AB. And this week on Mama Murdah Podcast, we're covering another super hard, super heavy hitter, real heart heavy, real hard to talk about, super tragic, super sad, super overwhelming. And I'm still not sure why I do this to us. I'm really sorry. This week, we're going to be covering the case of Jessie Lunsford. She was abducted in her own home by a neighbor and then buried alive only feet away from where she lived. This is another super hard case, and it's one that I have covered before on the Murdah Ink Podcast. So, if you were a listener of Murdah Ink, you probably heard this case before, but that audio is not available anymore. So I figured, why the hell not just sprinkle a few of my older cases in on the new podcast, especially when I don't have time to research. So, here we are. Aside from that little tidbit of me having covered this case before, this case changed so many laws and the ways that things are handled when sex offenders are involved in crimes. So, without any further ado, let's get it. Jessie Lunsford was actually born in the same city that I was born and raised in, which I thought was pretty cool. Jessie was born in Gastonia, North Carolina, and I don't live there anymore. Sorry, creepers. She was born on October 5th, 1995, and her parents were Mark Lunsford and Angie Bryant. Jessie was known by everyone that knew her best as just Jessie. I wasn't able to find a lot about her parents' early life and marriage together, besides the fact that the couple was married in 1992, and aside from the fact that Angie had a ton of miscarriages before she was able to conceive Jessie. So Jessie was kind of like their miracle rainbow baby, and the couple would go on to split up not too long after Jessie was born. Jessie was actually only about a year old when the couple finally called it quits. Mark was granted full custody of Jessie, which is weird, especially for North Carolina. I'm not sure why I did not look. It is not important. So Mark and Jessie lived in Gastonia, North Carolina for a little while, for the most part of her life, from what I could find anyways. But by the time Jessie was 9, she and her dad had moved to Homosassa, Florida? I have no idea if that's right. Where they lived with Mark's parents, Ruth and Archie Lunsford, in their mobile home. Because what better way to be a single dad than to live with your parents? They'd be able to help Mark out with Jessie, and Jessie would be able to grow up in the same house with her grandparents. Seems like a win-win-win all the way around. This would be the same home that Jessie would inevitably go missing from in the middle of the night, while both of her grandparents were asleep inside the same mobile home that she would go missing from. And because Jessie's dad, Mark, was a single dad, he took all the help from his parents that, they were willing to offer. Mark drove some kind of heavy machinery, and he often worked long, grueling hours for his job. Some days he would work anywhere from 15 to 20 hours a day. But no matter how much he worked, he would always head straight home to hang out with his parents and Jessie. You really can't be mad at that, because Mark seemed like the best kind of dad, and he and Jessie were as thick as thieves, and anyone that knew the family would tell you the same thing. Jessie was a happy little girl. She loved to go to church. She enjoyed spending time with her family, and her family enjoyed spending time with her. If there's one thing that everybody could agree on, it was the fact that Jessie was the biggest kind of daddy's girl. Jessie's mom, Angela, would eventually remarry and have another kid, and she would relocate to Ohio. From what I could find, Angie and Jessie hadn't seen each other in roughly 4 years before Jessie went missing, and their relationship almost seemed kind of non-existent, at least from what I could find. Jessie loved to sing along with her dad. She loved to sing Shania Twain and Pink, which I also ain't mad at. Jessie had big dreams of becoming a fashion designer, an Olympic swimmer, or, of course, a famous singer, because obviously what other kind of goals should a 9-year-old girl have? One other thing about Jessie that everybody could agree on was that she was afraid of the dark. She slept with a nightlight on every night, and the nightlight acted as like a safety thing for Jessie. The nightlight, along with a few different stuffed animals that she would always sleep with. One of her favorite stuffed animals was a dolphin that, of course, her dad won her at the county fair because Mark is that dad. The night before Jessie went missing, there was nothing out of the usual in the Lunsford house. Jessie had went to her usual youth group service at church. Her family had stopped at the Sonic restaurant to get dinner on their way home. She had taken a bath after they made it back home, and of course, no child's bedtime routine is complete without a snack. Jessie had her grandma Ruth tuck her into bed at about 9 p.m.-ish, just like every other night. Before Jessie took a bath, though, she made sure to kiss her daddy goodnight, and Mark had been dating somebody, around the time that Jessie went missing, and because Mark had no way of knowing what was going to happen that night after he left the house, He had planned to stay at his girlfriend's house that night, but he had also planned to come home the next morning to help Jessie get ready for school. So Jessie finished her bath and Mark left out for his girlfriend's house and everybody in the house went to bed. It seems like a typical night. And I'm sorry, I knew my voice was going to do this when I sat down to record. I have had like a weird thing going on. I'm not sure. I sound sick, but I feel fine. Work with me here. The last time anyone actually laid eyes on Jessie that night, on February 24th in 2005, was about 10 p.m. Ruth and Archie had both checked on Jessie before they'd went to sleep. And even though at some point during the middle of the night, Jessie was taken from her bed and was missing when Mark came in the next morning to get ready for work, Mark didn't know that Jessie was missing yet, because he'd come home pretty early to be able to be there while Jessie was getting ready for school and, so he could get ready for work. But after Mark got home that morning on February 25th, 2005, he heard Jessie's alarm clock going off in her room. And like most of us, Jessie's alarm went off every day at the same time. It went off every morning that she had school, and Jessie always got up and turned her alarm off. Mark started getting himself dressed for work, and he heard that the alarm clock was still going off, and he realized that Jessie hadn't got up and turned it off yet. So Mark went into Jessie's room to see why she hadn't gotten up and shut the alarm off yet. But when he walked into Jessie's room, though, she wasn't in her bed. Mark woke both of his parents up. He kind of just woke them up to see if maybe Jessie had crawled into bed with them at some point during the night, but she wasn't in their room either. Mark took another look around Jessie's room. He checked beside her bed, in her closet, and even under her bed. Mark checked the entire house, but Jessie wasn't anywhere inside the house. Mark checked the living room and all the closets and all the doors that would have normally been locked, and one thing that Mark did start to notice was that something else was missing. Their family dog, Corky, was also gone. And this is one of those dogs that the neighbors say bark continuously for absolutely no reason at all, but especially when somebody came into the house. And now Corky was just gone, and so was Jessie. Jessie's grandma Ruth called the police, and the police were out at the Lunsford house in no time. And at first, police kind of wondered if maybe Jessie had taken Corky the dog out for a walk and maybe just not said anything to anyone. But that was unlikely. For one, Jessie was scared of the dark, and it would have still been early enough outside in the morning to still be dark out, by the time that Mark realized that Jessie was gone. For two, she was too smart to just leave that early in the morning on her own to walk a dog that nobody knew she was taking for a walk. She would have also just never left the house and not told somebody. After the police were called, there were search dogs, police officers, and helicopters, and they were all searching the immediate areas and flying overhead in the search for Jessie. Most 9-year-old girls don't just run away from home. But there was one more thing that was missing with Jessie besides the family dog. That stuffed dolphin that Mark had won for Jessie at their local county fair. Mark also noticed that it was gone. But the outfit that Jessie had planned on wearing to school the next day was still laying in her room and hadn't been moved from where she had laid it, the night before when she was laying her school clothes out. So now we have a 9-year-old missing in her PJs? But how does a whole-ass kid go missing inside of a house that has more than one adult inside sleeping just a few feet away? It seems unreasonable, though not impossible. There was something that was noticed after Jessie went missing that no one was really sure whether it had been that way or not before this, before Jessie went missing. There was a cut in the screen door that led inside of the home. No one in the house was sure if that slit had been there before Jessie had gone missing, and if so, they had not really noticed it before, and they also weren't really sure if maybe somebody had done it intentionally to get in. So now this slit in the screen door could be something or it could be nothing. But also, how did somebody come into a house without Corky making all that noise? This was a dog that neighbors would actually say barked too much, like he was too barky. It doesn't seem plausible for somebody to be able to go into the house and Corky to not make a noise. Even after the family had searched the house time and time again, they had all somehow missed Corky being wrapped up in a pile of blankets and sleeping soundly on Mark's bed. So Corky wasn't actually missing, they had just overlooked him in the panic. Which, my dog Ryder does this all the time. Like, we can be looking for him and he's right in front of us the entire time. So, I could see how they'd miss the dog, but they're not going to miss an entire 9-year-old kid. Everyone that knew the Lunsford family said that all you had to do was pretend like you were going to walk into the yard and Corky would just start raising hell and trying to tear your ankles up. Police interviewed people that lived close by and everybody agreed that there wasn't a chance in hell that Corky was inside the house and that someone came in and took Jessie without Corky unleashing his bark from hell on them. So this led investigators to believe that if Jessie had gone missing from inside of her own house, then it would have had to have been somebody that lived in that house. Somebody that Corky would be familiar with coming and going. But after police looked into Mark's alibi about being at his girlfriend's house all night, that checked out. There was no possible way that Mark could have left his girlfriend's house, taken his own daughter, did something with her, and made it back to his girlfriend's house without his girlfriend noticing, and still been able to make it home before 5:30-ish in the morning when Jessica's alarm clock would have been going off. So that kind of rules Mark out altogether. So what about Jessie's grandparents, Ruth and Archie? They lived there too, and Corky would have been even more familiar with them coming and going as Corky was their dog. Even more familiar with them than he would have been with Jessie and Mark coming and going. So Jessie's grandparents, Ruth and Archie, are the next people that police need to kind of cross off their list. Police had to start asking Ruth and Archie the hardest kinds of questions. And Ruth kind of believed that if someone came into their house and took Jessie, that it would have to be somebody who knew that Mark wasn't going to be home that night. And it would have had to have been someone who knew where Jessie's room was, and that they would have also had to have known where Corky would have been so that he wouldn't bark. Because even if it was someone that Corky was familiar with, he would have still barked when they came into the house. So Ruth and Archie would have still been woken up by the barking either way. So I think the way that Ruth kind of figures it is whoever came in and took Jessie would have had to have known where Corky was. They would have had to have been super quiet so they didn't wake him up and he didn't, lose his little puppy shit. And after the police interviewed Ruth, they kind of ruled her out almost immediately. The way they saw it was that Ruth seemed way too emotionally distraught to be involved. Jessie seemed like Ruth's whole world, and the police have instincts just like everybody else. They also deal with people who try to lie and cover things up literally every day. That is their literal job. They honestly did not think Ruth was involved. Basically, she's off the suspect list. They've already been able to cross Mark off the suspect list because his alibi was airtight. They've, kind of used their instincts and intuition to cross Ruth off the list, so that only left one person who would have either been in or had access to the Lunsford house that night. That would have been Jessie's grandpa, Archie. He was the only other person in the house that night, and he seemed like a pretty good option at the time. Because when Archie sat down with investigators, they had already pulled his record for, his criminal background like they do literally every time they sit down with somebody for any kind of question and in any kind of investigation. And Jessie's grandpa, Archie, had the kind of criminal record that would throw up some pretty serious red flags in a kidnapping case. The investigators asked Archie if himself, if his son Mark, or even if Archie's dad had any kind of record with sexual battery or sexual abuse, and Archie said that none of them did. But in all actuality, Archie did. He had a few different charges. He had a kidnapping charge from Indianapolis that he'd gotten, which it sounds bad, but he had only gotten it because of the son that he'd had with his previous wife. When Archie and his first wife were in the process of separating, Archie left his wife and took his son with him. So that charge sounds scary, but it's understandable. Then there's another charge that the investigators probably thought that this would be like a huge turning point in their investigation, because Archie had a previous attempted rape charge. This attempted rape charge was eventually dropped because the girl that he had allegedly tried to rape didn't show up to court when the time came. So the police could still pull it up on his criminal record, but Archie freely told him that it was a long time ago and that he had been on a beach with a young girl that he'd known. And, she tried to say that he raped her, but, he didn't. And, she didn't show up when it came time for court. And that he said that he wasn't even aware that this was still on his record. For one, it was so long ago, but for two, he was never actually charged with anything. And they'd already asked him if there was any history of sexual abuse or battery in his family, and he'd already told them no. So it kind of seemed to investigators like Archie was lying to him, and like maybe he was just hoping that they weren't going to check their facts. So at this point, it seems like Archie was the only suspect that really made sense for these investigators. Even Archie himself kept telling investigators that he couldn't wrap his head around how someone would be able to come into their house and take Jessie without anyone noticing and without Corky absolutely losing his mind. So even Archie seemed to realize that this didn't make a whole lot of sense. But he was also adamant that he had nothing to do with Jessie's disappearance. And this is the point in the interrogation when one of the officers flat out accuses Archie of sexually abusing his own granddaughter. The officer even goes so far as to ask Archie, quote, "Do you not feel bad?" Archie just calmly responds and tells the officers that He's not sure how he's supposed to feel about his granddaughter being missing, that it's a lot going on, and the officer just goes into this whole thing about Jessie being in school and learning things about sex, and, maybe after she learned what sexual assault was, that she was threatening to tell somebody that her grandpa had been sexually abusing her, and, it just goes on and on and on like this. But this is when Archie shuts that whole ass interrogation down because he was pissed, and rightfully so. If he didn't have anything to do with Jessie being missing, and if he wasn't actually sexually abusing her, then he would have every right to be irate pissed with this line of questioning. One thing that Archie said to the officers who was blatantly just accusing him of, having something to do with Jessie being missing kind of had me cracking up because Archie said, quote, "If you had to get an education to do this, then buddy, your money was wasted." And I feel like that's kind of a mic drop moment for Archie, and I love it. But these officers needed answers, and they needed them now. But so did Jessie's family. The investigators weren't the only ones that were trying to figure out what had happened. So eventually the investigators are so convinced that Archie was involved that they actually send Mark into the interrogation room to talk to his dad. Archie and Mark have an emotional talk about how Archie would never hurt Jessie and how Mark doesn't think his dad's involved, but that the officers just keep telling Mark that, Archie may be their only chance to figure out where Jessie is, and, maybe if Mark would go in and talk to his dad, he would break down and tell him what happened, and, both men are crying, both men are pissed, and both men are just really trying to keep their shit together. At one point, Mark even asked Archie to forgive him for even coming into the interrogation room to start with. He's like, please forgive me for even asking if you know where Jessie is. Of course you don't. You're my dad. You're her grandpa. You love us. It's really sad. And after the officers did these first initial interviews, there were days and days and days with no sign of Jessie. No new evidence, and search efforts are still going on. The community's coming together to try to help search, and it's just not a lot of substance turning up anywhere. And it was on day 3 or 4 after Jessie had first been reported missing that police finally started pulling sex offender criminal records from people that live close by the Lunsford house. There were more than 50 people on the child sex offender registry just within the zip code of where Jessie lived. And they were looking into all of them when they stumbled across a man by the name of John Cooey. John Cooey was a 46-year-old trash human, and they wanted to speak to him. Now, they were finally starting to look into somebody besides the people that lived in the same house with Jessie, because obviously that wasn't getting them anywhere, and at the end of this case, this is going to piss all of us off because they spent so much time focusing on the people that Jessie lived with that they probably could have saved her if they hadn't have done that. But then again, in the same breath that I say that, I say this. In damn near every case I've ever heard, read about, researched, it is actually the people that are closest to the victim that are responsible. So maybe it just pisses me off because I know how this ends, and I just wish they would have done things differently. But, logically, I see why they went the way that they did to start with. The investigators were able to find out that John Cooey was a convicted sex offender, and he was listed on the sex offender registry. But they learned that John had been sentenced to 10 years in prison for messing with a young girl during a home burglary, and that he had been released early in 1980. And then again in 1991, he was convicted for messing with yet another kid, and he was released yet again early from prison. But he had quite a few other kinds of charges from 1991. Both of his sex offender charges were charges that involved 5-year-old girls. That wasn't all of John's criminal record, though. He had been arrested tons of times within the last 30 years for other things, too. Some of his charges were like drunk and disorderly, driving without a license, carrying a concealed weapon, burglary charges, indecent exposure charges, and that's literally just a few of them. That's not even the whole shebang of his charges. And there were even more than these 2 times that John sexually abused super young kids that didn't get reported, and we'll get into how we know this later on. So when the police brought John's name to Mark basically told the investigators that he just didn't see Jessie going with a complete stranger, especially in the middle of the night. And later during interviews with John's family members, his own niece admits that he sexually abused both of them when they were between the ages of 5 and 7. And apparently John's sister knew about the sexual assaults that had been done to her daughters by her brother, and somehow he was still allowed around the kids. that's a topic for another day because I cannot figure out what the hell is wrong with people. But John Couey lived in the trailer right across the street from the Lunsford house. 65 feet away from the Lunsford house, to be exact. And the police had actually went to John's sister Dorothy's house, where John had been staying, when Jessie was initially reported missing. But at the time, they didn't know that John had been living there. One of John's nieces told the officers that she bought her Uncle John a bus ticket to Savannah, Georgia, but that she didn't know when he actually left Florida because the bus ticket could be used at any time. This was the same niece that John had sexually abused as a kid that was now buying him a bus ticket to leave town just days after Jessie had been reported missing. Can we please see some red flags? So when the police had gone to John's sister's house right after Jessie had been reported missing, he wasn't there and nobody thought to say anything when they found out that a little girl was missing. They didn't say a single word about John or the fact that he lived in that house. So now the investigation is rolling up on the 2-week mark since 9-year-old Jessie had vanished in the middle of the night from her own house. And police are finally looking for John Couey to question him. He's an official person of interest in Jessie's case now. But John was already in Savannah, Georgia, thanks to that niece that he molested as a kid. John was drinking beer and living his best life. Luckily, though, he did have a warrant out for him for something that was unrelated to Jessie's case. So when and if the police found him, they would be able to bring him in immediately and get in touch with the Florida officers so that they would be able to come in and question him about Jessie's disappearance. And since the police were on the hunt for him, they had sent out a BOLO or a be on the lookout in all the states that surround Florida. They had his picture on every news station in Florida, Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, Tennessee, and thank God it wouldn't take them long to find him because of that. An officer saw John in Georgia standing on the side of the road, so the officer asked him his name, and, she pulled it up and saw that he had to be on the lookout. So John Couey, she was able to arrest John Couey in Augusta, Georgia. The officer that arrested John said that when she arrested him, he didn't even ask what he was being arrested for. The officers that were working Jessie's case back in Florida got word that John Couey had finally been located and arrested, so they hauled ass to Georgia to interview him while he was still in police custody on the warrant that didn't have anything to do with Jessie's case. The officers started off questioning John, trying to sympathize with the way that he was raised and, some of the things that happened to him as a kid because he was raped as a kid. And this is one of those things where we kind of feel bad for the kid, but not for the adult. Because bad things happen to kids all the time, sadly, and a lot of them don't turn out like this. But after their sympathy didn't work, they went straight into him being a sexual predator of young girls. John openly admits to molesting and assaulting his nieces when they were between the ages of 5 and 7, and he freely admits that he has a problem. But for hours and hours and hours, John denies knowing anything about Jessie or her whereabouts. The detectives pressed him over and over and over again, and John just swore up and down that he had never even seen Jessie, even though he lived right across the street, so that had to be the lie of the century. John claimed that all that he knew about Jessie was what he had seen on the news and whatever the TV stations had said about her, and one officer was just completely done with John's bullshit. And I wrote this quote down because I feel like this would be me if I was an investigator. Literally, it would be me. John says that he only knows what he's seen on the news and what the TV's been saying about Jessie. And this officer says, quote, "I don't think you got her, but I think you know where she's at." John goes on to say that he doesn't know anything, and the officer says, quote, "I think you do." And then he tells John, quote, "You did this to yourself, but fucking running? Okay, so you blame yourself when your damn picture's blasted all on the TV. Because all you had to do was come to me, instead of walking out the fucking back door and sneaking around like some goddamn yard rat. So you're getting everything you fucking deserve." And that is definitely something that I would say if I were questioning a garbage human like John Couey. But John kept up with his shenanigans and his charades about not having a thing to do with Jessie being missing and swearing that he doesn't know what happened to her or where she is. Finally, these officers just call it quits because you can only ask the same question so many times, and because John was not budging. But for whatever unknown reason, the next morning, John told the correctional officer that he had something he needed to talk to the detectives about, and that he only needed to talk to the officers that were working on the Jessie Lunsford case. Which is, I guess I'm glad he decided to talk, I guess. So when the officers get into the interrogation room, John immediately starts crying. He's telling the officers that he does know what happened to Jessie and, John just goes into this confession that nobody is ready for, and let's get into it, I guess. John tells the officers that he had seen Jessie playing with Corky in the yard a few times, and that he'd seen her checking the mail, and that he thought that the only person that lived in the house with Jessie was her Grandma Ruth. So he's not only a trash human, he's also an idiot. There are literally 2 other adults living in that house with Jessie besides her Grandma Ruth. John goes on to say that he drank a few beers the night of February 24th in 2005, and that at about 3 o'clock in the morning, he went across the street to the Lunsford house. John told the officers that he was the one that had cut the L shape into the screen door, and that the screen door had been the first place that he tried to get into the house from, but that the door behind the screen door had been locked. So instead of giving up and going home, John tried a lot of the windows to see if they were unlocked, and luckily they were all locked shut. But John, he's no quitter, because that still wasn't enough of a reason for him to turn around and change his mind and go his ass back home. He tried one last attempt at getting in the Lunsford house that night, and when he turned the handle of the door that led to the Lunsford's kitchen from outside, it opened right up. The door was unlocked. And just like that, John Cooey was inside the house. When the officers asked if John saw or heard a dog, he said that he knew they had a dog because he had seen Jessie playing with it in the yard, but that he didn't hear or see the dog while he was inside their house. And even more stomach-twisting than that, John said out of his own mouth that if the dog would have barked, that he probably would have chickened out and just turned around and left. Like, that would have scared him off. Like, damn it, Corky, you had one job. One job. The only thing that Ruth and Archie can come up with on why Corky didn't hear John enter in the house that night, they say that every once in a while, Corky would wear himself out so bad that he would wrap his little body up in blankets, and that once he fell asleep, he was asleep. And I get this because, again, my dog does the same shit. John had to walk right by Archie and Ruth in their bed asleep in order to get to Jessie's open bedroom door. John says that the only question that Jessie asked him was if she could take one of her toys with her. John agreed that she could pick a toy and take it with her, and she grabbed, of course, the stuffed dolphin that she loved so much that her dad Mark had gotten her at the county fair. John Cooey himself said that Jessie was such a polite and well-mannered little girl that she asked quietly and politely if she could bring one of her toys with her. John said that he walked Jessie across the street, and she did exactly as he said. From here, it's going to get rough, so I am going to throw in a children's sexual assault warning. Skip ahead about 2 minutes, and we should be past this. From here, John made Jessie go into the trailer where he was living with and probably off of his sister, and that the 2 of them went into his bedroom where John locked the door behind them. In John's own words, he said that the 2 laid down on the bed, and that as soon as he laid down with her, he started fondling Jessie. John then made 9-year-old Jessie touch him until he ejaculated. John said that when he was done, he asked Jessie if anyone had ever made her do that before, or if anyone had ever touched her like that before, and she'd told him no. So all of those accusations that police were throwing at Archie were way off base. John says that they then laid down and went to sleep. And detectives asked if Jessie was screaming or crying, and John told them no, that she had tried to pull her hand away from him a few times, but that the entire time that he had her, she did exactly what she was told. John even said, quote, "For some reason, she was a very polite girl, which just makes my stomach knot up so hard." John said that he didn't penetrate Jessie on the first night that he had her, and the way he says this is like he deserves a cookie or something. John lived with his sister and a shit ton of other relatives of some kind in this mobile home that was literally just across the street from where Jessie and her family lived. People are always coming and going and couch hopping from this trailer where John lived with his sister. And the next morning, John said that he woke up to everybody in the house looking out the windows and watching while the entire neighborhood was outside searching for Jessie. He made Jessie get up out of the bed and he put her in his bedroom closet so that, he could go into the rest of the house and pretend not to know what the police were looking for. And this is the place in the investigation that we find out that on the morning that Jessie was reported missing, when police knocked on John's sister's door, John was home and Jessie was still alive. John said that police came in and looked around the house, but that they didn't look very good. And then John let the detectives know that he had been in the backyard after they'd knocked on the door and talked to what they thought was everybody that lived in that house. One of the officers had actually seen John in the backyard trying to hide, and when they went back to the back door to ask who the man was, One of John's niece's boyfriends came out from a back bedroom. So the officer just assumed that was the boyfriend was who was in the backyard, when in all reality, it had been John. And once the officer spotted him in the backyard and he went back inside, only for the boyfriend to come out, that's when John had actually snuck himself back into the house without them knowing or seeing. So if the officers would have just went through the house like they should have, they would have found Jessie alive. Because nobody in that house besides John knew that she was there, supposedly. So everyone in the house let police come in and look around. They didn't know they had a reason not to. Jessie was in the bedroom closet the entire time the police were in this house. John didn't have Jessie tied up. She didn't try to run or get away from him. And according to him, he kept Jessie in the closet for 3 days. When the officers asked why he thought Jessie stayed so quiet for so long, the only thing John could say was, quote, "I don't know. I don't understand it either. She was just a very polite, well-mannered girl." And John would even leave Jessie in the closet inside of his bedroom all day while he reported to work. Forensics would later find that she was in fact alive from anywhere for 2 to 3 days before her death. The people that John lived with in the house were all questioned after his confession, and they all said the same thing. That John always stayed hidden in his room. He only came out to either eat or use the restroom, but besides that, he was always in his room. They all claimed that they didn't hear Jessie the entire time that she was being held against her will there, and that they had no idea that he had even taken her up until he'd made his confession. John said that he would make Jessie stay inside the closet all day until everybody in the house went to bed, and then that's when he would open the closet door, pull his pants down, and make this sweet baby do disgusting things to him until he got off. John said out of his own mouth that he and Jessie hardly ever spoke to one another, that he fed her every night, and that he only ever actually raped her once. And again, he says this like he deserves an award or some shit. John claimed that he had planned to let Jessie go home up until he raped her, and then he panicked and didn't know what else to do with her, which I'm calling the biggest amount of bullshit on this. John also tells the officers that when he raped her, he climbed on top of her. When they asked if he ejaculated inside of her, John said, quote, "Yes, sir, my DNA's in her," which is just sickening. Y'all, The officers then asked John about the blood that was found on his bed after his confession. John told him that the blood was from vaginal bleeding from the rape, and that Jessie had told him she felt like she was bleeding like she would if she were on her period. After the rape, Jessie was made to go back into the closet, while John went outside to dig her a grave. When John came back in, he tied Jessie's hands up, and he walked her outside to his backyard. From here is where he told Jessie to step into a trash bag, like the kind of trash bag that you would buy to clean up leaves and branches out in your yard. When he told Jessie to get inside the trash bag, she did exactly as she was told. She didn't scream. She didn't fight with him. She didn't try to run. She did exactly what this adult asked her to do. And everybody that knew Jessie said that this did not come as a shock to them, that she would just go with whatever a complete stranger says without knowing why. That Jessie always did as an adult asked, and she never questioned adult authority. She was just that well-mannered and that polite, which blows my mind because they were just doing the right thing as parents. They were taking care of their kid, teaching her to be respectful, to, respect her elders and mind her manners. Those things were so engraved in her and her upbringing that it's part of the reason why she was the perfect target for this sick, twisted shit stain of a man. The entire time that John had Jessie, she did exactly as she was told. She never talked back, she never questioned him, and she even said please and thank you every time she asked for food or drink, and he brought it to her. She did the exact thing that we all try to instill in our own kids, and I think that's why this case grabbed me in the way that it did. Because we all want our kids to not question adult authority and to do as they're told and to say please and thank you, and Jessie did all that. She did it to a fault. So if a small child-sized grave and a child inside of an actual trash bag wasn't enough, John Couey double-bagged Jessie as if she were a gallon of milk. From here, John helped Jessie into the grave that he had dug for her, and she laid down. He then buried Jessie alive inside of a double-bagged trash bag. He covered the dirt pile of her graves with stick, leaves, and brush from the yard outside. John then went back inside of his trailer, and he slept like a baby. Jessie's body would be discovered about 150 yards from her own house, about 3 weeks after she had been reported missing. She was that close to her home, her family, her toys, and her dog this entire time. But she followed every instruction that this man, who was older than her, gave. And he took full advantage of that. Jessie was found inside of 2 trash bags, just like John said she would be. She had been buried with her stuffed dolphin, and there were also 2 small finger holes poked through the bag that looked like she had tried to make room for more air to come through as she suffocated to death after being buried alive. Her cause of death would be ruled as murder by live burial. This entire case just makes me sick to my stomach in the most real way. Even with his whole-ass graphic and detailed confession, John still pled not guilty, and I will never understand who is able to sleep at night after they defend a man like John Couey. The police seriously screwed up this investigation to the nth degree. They screwed up this investigation. They didn't grant John a request to speak with a lawyer when he'd first been arrested, so his entire confession was inadmissible in court. The jury would never get to hear all the gory, graphic details that John went into when he relived how he murdered the sweetest 9-year-old girl. So now police have searched the same house that Jessie was actually in. Since John's whole-ass confession wasn't going to be able to be used in court, luckily there was enough DNA between his bed, where Jessie had bled after the rape, and the closet where she had been held. So this left police with multiple fingerprints that belonged to Jessie all over the closet, and John's literal DNA being found inside of Jessie's body. The fact that her body was literally buried in his backyard, it doesn't hurt. So they were thankfully still able to get a conviction for John Couey in March of 2007. John was given the death penalty, which still isn't enough. And Mark Lunsford spoke after John's sentencing, and he did not try to hide the fact that he was speaking directly to John as he said, quote, "I hope you hear her cries as you try to sleep at night. I hope you see the tears run down her face when she asks you to go home. I hope you spend the rest of your life in fear of death. You will never hurt another child again. Judge Howard, speaking for myself and for my community and for the nation, I plead with you to accept the recommendation of the jury for death. And remember the words of a wise old black man in Terravese. It's just too heavy, Your Honor. It's too heavy for mercy." The judge would go on to sentence John to the death penalty, but I feel like God watched what John did to little Jessie from heaven, and he was like, I'll handle this one, guys. John died 2 years later after he was sentenced to death in the state of Florida from anal cancer. That, my friends, is what I'd like to call poetic justice. There was a new bill put into place after Jessie's story pissed literally everyone in the nation off, and it's called Jessica's Law. This bill was put into place for any adult that performs sex acts on a child under the age of 12 will automatically get a felony life sentence, no questions asked, you do not pass go, you do not collect $200, you go straight your ass to jail with a felony charge and a life sentence. Which sounds awesome, except for this law isn't active in all 50 states yet. Her case happened in 2005, but almost every state has their own version of what would be considered Jessica's Law. It's just usually a different amount of time instead of the 25-year sentence that Jessica's Law holds. And I've watched tons and tons of interviews with Mark, and he's made it his life's mission to get Jessica's Law in every state, which at first I was here for. I was all for it, until I saw something on a site that said that they had rejected Jessica's Law because of a repeat offender, knowing that they will automatically get a 25-year sentence if they get caught, makes the chances of them just murdering their victim instead of getting caught grow to a ridiculously higher number. So it's a double-edged sword in the most literal way. The only reason we know about a lot of the child sex crimes is because the victims aren't dead and they can still tell us about the crimes that were committed against them. So I could see how that would kind of deter a criminal into just murdering their victim versus worrying about getting caught. And I know this case was heavy on the heart and probably heavy on the F-bombs. I don't know. But it needs to be talked about, especially when this case could have been so easily prevented. The police were so focused on the people that love Jessie that they missed the monster living right next door. And I'll try to find something not so heavy for the heart next week. I don't ever make promises because I never know if I can keep them. I think that's all I have for you this week. You can follow me on social media by searching murdered_mama on anything except Facebook, because on Facebook you can just search Mama Murdered a Podcast and you should be able to find me. And I think that's all we have this week on this case. And y'all, there is one more thing you can do to help me out. Do me a favor, a solid. whatever you want to call it, before I jump off. If you have been listening to the podcast and you enjoy it, share it, like it, follow it, rate it, review it, and tell a friend, tell anybody. Tell the cashier at the grocery store. She may love it. Hell, we don't know. It's growing, and it's growing a lot faster and a lot more, I don't know, the downloads are just spiking, and really, I'm kind of excited. I'm getting tongue-tied. I'm excited, but it's growing. It's getting out. It's getting, people are finding it. So, help your girl out. Send it to a friend. Tell somebody to search it. Send them an episode that you think they might like. It cannot hurt. It can only help. We're only going up from here, y'all. We're only going up from here. So, what do you say? Let's do it again. Same time, same place, next Wednesday. See you then.
That's how my mama murdered a podcast.